Hello, my name is Alice, and in today's mini tip tutorial I'm going to talk about ripping back or unpicking stitches. When I teach, I see a lot of people who really struggle with unpicking even this basic stocking stitch. So today I'm going to go through how I will unpick stitch by stitch in a basic stocking stitch and how I would unpick several rows at a time. And then I'm going to do the same with a lace pattern. So let's start with stocking stitch because that's easier. Now, if you're not confident when it comes to picking and fixing mistakes and things like that, you really need to practice. It's not something that's going to just happen. If you are doing it, if you're knitting a sweater or a big lace shawl or something like that and you make a mistake, fixing it can be quite difficult, and it's much better if you've practiced on a swatch that doesn't really matter. So when it comes to the real thing, you've got the confidence to just do it. Okay, so when I'm unpicking, so say I'm unpicking stocking stitch, I like to keep the right side facing me all the time, because the right side is the one I'm going to be seeing. So if I can keep an eye on the right side just to see what it looks like. So we're going to unpick this stitch by stitch. Now, because I knit a continental way, I'm holding my yarn just as I do when I knit. So the yarn's in my left hand. So to unpick, what I do is I pull the working yarn. So whichever hand you hold your yarn in, just pull the working yarn so that it kind of opens up the stitch, and then just put the needle in to the stitch below and unpick it. So you're just going into the stitch below the one that's on the needle. Now, one of the problems people have when they unpick is they end up with the stitches twisted. So instead of sitting that way around, it ends up sitting that way around. So the leading legs at the back. Now, if you are when you're doing a stitch, if you put the needle in from back to front like that, you will end up with the stitch sitting the right way. So if you go from back to front, back to front, if you go in like that, front to back, you end up with a twisted. Front to back, you end up with a twisted. So you need to, let me just untwist those quickly. So you need to go in from from back to front. And the more practice you get, the quicker you get at it. Now, if you're unpicking several rows, then this can be a bit of a slow way to do it. Depending on how much confidence you've got and how what kind of yarn you're using and what stitch pattern it is, you can just sometimes just pull the whole needle out and rip back whatever you need to, and then put the needle back in. If you've got a yarn that doesn't unravel easily, then that's quite that's not too terrifying. But if you're doing lace knitting or cables or fair isle, or you've got a slippery yarn, then that can be quite scary. Now, I do recommend using a lifeline, and I will put the link below to my tutorial on how to use lifeline, so do check that out as well. So sometimes if I'm ripping back several rows, I will actually unpick several rows in one go. So rather than going back stitch by stitch like I just did, I will do several rows in one go. Now, the problem with this way of doing it is that you do end up with a lot of yarn. You can't sort of wind the yarn up as you go. So if you have a yarn that tangles easily, you can end up with a bit of a mess. So just a little bit of a warning. So I decide how many rows I'm going to go down. So that's one row down, and because I've slipped the stitches along this side, one stitch is 2 rows. So I'm going to go, so I basically start along the edge. I undo that's the first 2 stitches I've undone. So I've now got 3 strands here. You see that? So I'm undoing 3 rows. So I just hold those 3 strands. I look for which stitch the bottom strand comes out of, and then I just put my needle into that stitch and slip it off. Now, because I'm going from left to right with the right side facing me, I can now put my needle in front to back. Remember, before I said to put it in back to front because I was going that way. Now I'm going the other way because I've still got the knit side facing me. I'm going front to back, so the stitches are ending up sitting the right way on my needles. It doesn't matter if they end up twisted as long as you're aware of it and you correct them before you knit the first row or as you knit the first row. So I just hold the 3, or how many strands I'm picking, how many rows. You got 1 strand per row, so I'm going down 3 rows. Hold those tight, and you can see it kind of opens up that stitch that the 3rd strand down comes out of. So I just put my needle in and I unravel those. Needle in and unravel. So this can be quite a quick way to undo several rows, especially if you say you've got to do sort of, I don't know, 4 or 5 rows. This can be quite a quick way of doing it, without having to pull your needles out and just ripping it back quickly, which might be a bit scary. So we're just going to go across this row. Now sometimes, depending on the yarn, if the yarn sticks a bit to itself, you just got to give it a bit of a tug. As long as your yarn's not very fragile, then be a bit careful. So as you can see, the top strand is attached to the ball. That's unraveling, and I can wind that onto the ball as I go. The other 2 strands come off as a loop. Okay, and that's why you can't wind all the yarn up as you go, and that's why you end up in a bit of a tangle. So now I come to the last 2 stitches, which I've done in garter stitch. Okay, and then that's the last stitch. So what I'm going to do with the last stitch is just pull it out. Okay, and I did that last stitch, I did 1 row too many. So I'm just turning it and just knitting that last stitch again. There we go. So now, instead of having a loop, I've now just got this strand of yarn. Okay, so that's how I unpick several rows at a time. Now, if you've got to go a long way down, some people like to, instead of doing it like that, some people like to insert a needle into a row further down, like that. So they'll just pick a row, they'll insert the needles like that, and then they'll pull that needle out and quickly unravel. The problem I find with doing this is that if it's just stocking stitch in one colour, sometimes it can be difficult to find which row you're on and stick to the same row. Sometimes I find I'm going, you know, a bit zigzaggy, especially if it's a long piece. If you've got colour changes or you've got a pattern, it can be easier to do that, but on just plain stocking stitch in one colour, I find that quite difficult. But what you do is you're basically picking up, each stitch has got 2 legs, and you're picking up the first leg of each stitch. But sometimes, like here, I'm thinking, is it that one, is it that one? I think it's that one. This can be a bit difficult to do, which is why I prefer to just put the needle in several rows down. So I'm picking that edge stitch there, I take the first stitch off the needle, let it unravel, and then I go, okay, that bottom yarn goes into there. Just keep, if you're keeping track of your rows, you've got to keep track of how many rows you've unraveled as well, obviously, so you know where in the pattern you are, and you can see how many rows you're unraveling by how many strands of yarn you have, because you will have 1 per row. Now this one, because I got the right side facing me and I'm going backwards, or I'm going in the direction I would normally knit, to make sure that my stitches aren't twisted, I go from back to front. When I'm going that way, so the other way, I go front to back. Okay, so I'm going to put that aside, and I'm going to have a look at how to undo lace knitting. So that's probably something that people struggle with a bit more. Lace knitting, cable knitting is even more difficult. Problem with lace knitting is that you have decreases. That decreases on my needle now show us just 1 stitch, but when I unpick them, they become 2 stitches. So I have finished a right side row, and I'm going to unpick 1 right side row to start with. And I'm going to show you how I do that and how I deal with the decreases. So, first stitch, because I'm going backwards, I'm going to put my needle in from front to back, just like I did with the stocking stitch. So needle goes in from the front to the back, and then I let the stitch sort of slip off on my left needle. So now I'm coming to my first decrease. This is a knit 2 together. So I got, I don't know whether you can see, but I've got 2 stitches there. So when I put my needle into that stitch, just make sure I go through both stitches. So you see I've ended up with 2 there, and they were knit 2 together, so they're not twisted or anything. They'll just sit nicely like that. And then here I've got an SSK. SSK leans to the left. When you do an SSK, you twist 2 stitches and then you knit them through the back loop. So if I put my needle in through the front, like I just did on the other side, they're going to end up really twisted. So what I do with SSK is I put my needle in through the back, so from the back to front, and then I slip them off. But then they are actually twisted on my needle, so I then take them off and untwist them. Okay, now whether you untwist stitches as you go, whether you do it on the first or the next row, depends on how confident you are with what you're doing. Now when you come to a yarn, so that's a knit 2 together again. You can see that. Knit 2 together, so knit 2 together leans to the right, and it's not, the stitches are not twisted, so I can just put my needle in like I do with the other stitches, front to back, into both stitches, and I end up with 2 stitches on that needle. So that's a knit stitch, and then we got an SSK. Now because they are twisted and they're leaning that way, I'm going to put my needle in from back to front and slip them off, and then they are twisted, so I just take them off and then twist them and put them back on. Now when I come to a yarn over, because that's just a loop over my needle, so when I unpick the stitch after the yarn over, so we've got yarn over there and then a knit stitch. When I unpick that knit stitch, quite often the yarn over will just come off at the same time, because the yarn over is just that. So once you've undone the stitch after it, there's nothing to secure it. Okay. And we just got a couple more stitches. Now the first stitch, because I slipped the first stitch, I don't have to actually unpick it because I haven't knitted it. Okay, so that's just undoing 1 row of lace knitting. Now I'm just going to show you how I would do if I was undoing several rows down. So I'm going to try and go in with, try and do 3 or 4 rows. So that's 2 rows. If I go into the second edge stitch, that's 3 rows. So you can see now I've got that little loop there, represents 2 rows, and that's 1 row. So I'm doing 3 rows. And then I go into the next stitch and pull my needles out. Now what you need to look out for this is if you have any decreases. So here, I don't know whether you can see this, but on the row below the last row, so on the second row down, I've got an SSK. So if I undo the first stitch, that's fine. And then here I've got 2 stitches. Oh, there we go. So I've done this a little bit more carefully. Okay, and then I'm going into the next one, which is just 1 stitch. Next one, which is just 1 stitch. Next one. Now the only way to get good at this is to practice and do it, and the only way to recognize what the stitches are. So here I've got, again, on the row below the second row down, that's a decrease, that's 2 stitches together. So let me just show you what happens. So if I go into the first stitch, which is a yarn over, because you can see I've got a big hole there, unravel it. Now can you see I end up with another stitch there? So I just got to make sure that I catch that stitch and just don't let that unravel any further. So that is the difficult thing when you've got undoing several rows at a time and you've got decreases. Now same thing's happening here. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can either go into, so that's the second row down, you can either go into that decrease first, into both stitches, and unravel the first row. So now you've got 2 stitches on there, and then you can go into those and unravel the third row. Or you can just do it all 3 rows, which I'll do next. Hang on. Okay, so that's another row where I've got a decrease. So that's the first stitch, and that's the second stitch of the decrease on the second row. So undo that one and unravel it, and I got both those stitches on my needle. Okay, and then the next row, and the next row, Now quite often when I come to the last couple of stitches, I just take them both off and I just unravel them and then just make sure I catch them. And if I find I've undone one stitch too many, so say I've undone that edge stitch which I shouldn't undo, I can then just knit it again or do whatever I'm doing with it. Right, so I'm going to unpick one more row because on this row I've got some double decreases. So I just want to show you how to do a double decrease. So I'm just going to go back one row now. One more. Right, so here I got my first double decrease. So that's a slip on, knit two together, pass slip stitch over. So I got one stitch here, but on the row below I had 3 stitches. So you've got to make sure if you just pull that out like that, you end up with 3 stitches. And you just got to make sure you catch them. Now don't pull on the yarn. If you end up like this where the stitches just fall down, don't pull on your knitting because they'll unravel. Just quickly put your needle through them, and even if say the first one unravels slightly, pick it up anyway. You can always fix it later. You just don't want it unraveling any further than it absolutely has to. So I'm just going to go back to the next double decrease quickly. Okay, so that's the next double decrease. So let's have a look at it. So this double decrease, you got one stitch here. This is a slip on, knit two together, pass slip stitch over. So you've got one stitch that's lifted over, so we can lift that one off. So now you've got one stitch you lift over, and then you've got a knit two together there. And then you can go into the knit two together and unravel it, and then you've got your slip on there. So you can just sort of drop the stitch, the decrease stitch off your needle and just unravel all 3, or you can just do it step by step like I did on that last one. So I've still got the same number of stitches. I haven't lost any stitches. My pattern is still intact below where I stopped picking out, and there's no big drama. Now obviously doing this takes a bit of practice. It's not something that you're going to just suddenly do on a project. So if you're knitting a big lace shawl in fine lace weight yarn, and you notice you made a mistake a few rows down, unpicking it like this for the first time is scary, it's intimidating, and you can just end up ruining your whole shawl. So I do recommend when you're knitting swatches, either just knit a swatch of different stitch patterns and practice unpicking it. Thank you very much for watching. You can get all the details about me at www.yarnaddict.co.uk, and you can find links to my workshops, patterns, social media, all that on my website, and there's a link below as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.